Imagine dying as one of the most powerful men in medieval Europe, not on a battlefield with honor. Not peacefully in your sleep surrounded by loved ones, but drowning in your own filth, your body literally rotting from the inside out while courtiers flee from the unbearable stench. This is not fiction. This is the documented fate of Henry, the Furs of England. The conqueror's son whose terrifying final days would shock a kingdom and shake the very foundations of medieval kingship. What you're about to hear is the true story of a ruler whose body betrayed him in the most horrific way imaginable. A death so undignified that it would cast doubt on the divine right of kings itself. Henry, the First of England, was born around 1068, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, the Norman king, who had seized England in 1066 and forever changed the course of British history. Unlike his elder brothers Robert and William, Rufus Henry was not initially expected to inherit any significant territory. His father famously left him no land, only a substantial sum of 5,000 pounds of silver, earning him the bitter nickname bootlegger or fine scholar. Because lacking lands to manage, he received a comprehensive education, unusual for a medieval prince. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Henry's intelligence, ruthlessness, and political cunning would eventually place him on the throne of England in circumstances drenched in blood and suspicion. The path to Henry's crown was paved with the bodies of his family members. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, his eldest son, Robert, inherited Normandy, while the second son, William Rufus, took England. Henry received his silver and little else, but he was patient and calculating. When William Rufus died in 1100, under mysterious circumstances during a hunting accident in the New Forest with an arrow through his lung, Henry was conveniently nearby. Within 3 days, he had ridden to Winchester, secured the royal treasury, and had himself crowned at Westminster Abbey before his elder brother Robert could return from the First Crusade. Many historians suspect Henry had a hand in his brother's death, though proof has never been found. What is certain is that Henry moved with a speed and efficiency that suggested careful planning. Once on the throne, Henry proved to be one of medieval England's most capable and effective rulers. He understood that power required more than military might. It demanded administrative excellence, legal reform, and the systematic control of the nobility who might otherwise tear the kingdom apart. He established the Exchequer, the first systematic financial administration in English history, creating meticulous records of royal income and expenses that allowed him to maximize revenue and maintain a powerful military without the constant need to tax his subjects into rebellion. He reformed the legal system, creating traveling judges who would bring royal justice to every corner of the realm, undermining the power of local lords and establishing the king's law as supreme. Henry's personal life was equally strategic. He married Matilda of Scotland, a descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon royal house, which helped legitimize Norman rule in the eyes of the English people who still remembered their conquered past. The marriage produced 2 legitimate children, William Madeline, his heir, and Matilda, who would later become central to the chaos that followed Henry's death. But Henry was also spectacularly promiscuous, holding the medieval record for acknowledged illegitimate children with at least 25 bastards by various mistresses. These children were not shameful secrets, but political tools, married off to strategic allies across England and Normandy, creating a web of family connections that strengthened Henry's power. Yet beneath this facade of strength and efficiency, Henry suffered from a condition that would increasingly dominate his life and ultimately kill him in the most horrific manner imaginable. From relatively early in his reign, courtiers noticed that the king would suddenly excuse himself from important meetings. His face pale and sweating, he would disappear for extended periods, returning exhausted and clearly unwell. The whispers began slowly, careful and discreet as befitted discussions of the king's health. But over time, they became impossible to ignore. Henry suffered from severe chronic digestive problems that manifested in violent bouts of diarrhea, stomach cramps, and digestive agony that would leave him incapacitated for days at a time. Medieval medicine understood almost nothing about digestive disorders. The prevailing medical theory inherited from ancient Greek physician Galen held that illness resulted from imbalances in the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Digestive problems were thought to indicate an excess of bile or corrupt humors that needed to be purged from the body. The treatments prescribed by Henry's physicians were not only useless, but actively harmful. They subjected him to regular bloodletting, opening veins in his arms to drain what they believed was corrupted blood. They prescribed powerful purgative herbs and concoctions designed to induce vomiting and further diarrhea, believing they were helping the body expel bad humors, when in reality they were dehydrating an already suffering patient and worsening his condition. The psychological toll of chronic illness on a medieval king cannot be overstated. In an age when kingship was understood as a divine mandate, when the king's body was seen as a reflection of the kingdom's health, physical weakness was not merely embarrassing, but politically dangerous. Henry's contemporaries believed that God chose kings and maintained them in power. A sick king suggested divine disfavor, a dangerous perception that could embolden rebels and weaken the loyalty of nobles who might wonder if God had withdrawn his blessing. Henry could never admit weakness, could never show vulnerability, even as his body betrayed him again and again. The stress of maintaining this facade, combined with the genuine demands of ruling two territories, often on the brink of war, only worsened his physical condition. Henry's relationship with his elder brother, Robert, perfectly illustrates how physical and political stress intertwined. Robert Curt, whose Duke of Normandy never accepted Henry's seizure of the English crown. From 1101 onwards, the brothers were locked in periodic conflicts, with Robert invading England in that first year, only to be bought off with a substantial payment. But the peace was temporary. In 1106, Henry invaded Normandy, and at the Battle of Tinchebray, he decisively defeated Robert's forces, captured his brother, and imprisoned him. Robert would spend the remaining 28 years of his life as Henry's prisoner, dying in Cardiff Castle in 1134, having outlived its usefulness. Henry's treatment of Robert was pragmatic and brutal, typical of the age. But it also reveals the paranoia that increasingly characterized his later years. The captured Robert was not simply imprisoned, but subjected to psychological torture designed to break his spirit completely. Henry ensured his brother was moved between various prisons, never allowed to become comfortable or established relationships with guards or local nobles, according to some chroniclers. Robert was at times kept in chains, his eyes reportedly put out to prevent any possibility of escape or recognition. If sympathetic supporters attempted to rescue, whether the blinding occurred is debated by historians. But what is certain is that Henry intended his brother's imprisonment to serve as both punishment and warning. No rival could expect mercy, not even family. This ruthlessness combined with Henry's increasingly poor health created the king who was both impressively effective and deeply isolated, surrounded by courtiers who feared rather than loved him. The administrative efficiency for which Henry is justly praised also reflects the mindset of a ruler who trusted no one completely. The exchequer was not merely a financial innovation, but a system of checks and controls designed to prevent embezzlement and ensure that every penny owed to the crown was collected and accounted for. Henry instituted the use of the exchequer table, a large board covered with a checkered cloth, where officials would calculate accounts using counters, creating a visual system that made fraud more difficult. He sent his officials throughout the realm to conduct regular audits, and woe to any sheriff or noble who could not account for every penny of royal revenue. The system worked brilliantly, filling Henry's treasury and funding his military campaigns, but it also made him deeply unpopular among the nobility who resented this unprecedented level of royal oversight. As the years passed, Henry's health problems became more frequent and more severe. By the 1120s, chroniclers were regularly noting periods when the king was too ill to conduct business. Forced to delegate responsibilities while he suffered in private, the nature of his illness meant it was difficult to conceal. Violent diarrhea and digestive distress produce unmistakable sounds and smells, and despite the best efforts of servants and courtiers to maintain discretion, everyone in the royal household knew when the king was suffering. The odor of illness hung around him, a constant reminder that even the most powerful man in England was subject to the humiliations of bodily decay. Medieval attitudes toward bodily functions were somewhat different from modern sensibilities. People lived in much closer proximity to animal and human waste. Chamber pots were emptied out, windows into streets, toilets where they existed at all with simple holes in stone, seats that dropped waste into pits or moats below. The smell of human waste was a normal part of daily life. Yet even by medieval standards, the king's condition was shocking. When the ruler of the realm spent days at a time effectively confined to a privy, when servants had to constantly clean up after their monarch, it created a cognitive dissonance that shook the foundations of how people understood royal authority. How could God's chosen ruler be reduced to such degrading circumstances? The stress of ruling while chronically ill manifested in Henry's increasing severity and paranoia. He had never been a kind or gentle man. Medieval kingship required ruthlessness. But in his later years, he became noticeably harsher. He increased the use of mutilation as punishment, particularly favoring the removal of eyes and testicles for various offenses. These were not random acts of cruelty, but calculated policies designed to incapacitate potential threats. Without the moral complications of execution, a blinded man could not fight or recognize conspirators. A castrated man could not father sons who might become future rivals. Henry's court became a place of whispered conversations and careful words where everyone understood that the sick king's temper was unpredictable and his mercy increasingly rare. The year 1120 brought tragedy that would have profound implications for Henry's final years. His legitimate son and heir, William Adelinde, died in the sinking of the White Ship disaster. The vessel, considered one of the finest ships of the age, was racing to cross the English Channel from Normandy to England, carrying William and much of the Anglo-Norman nobility, his younger generation. The crew and passengers were drunk, celebrating when the ship struck a rock and sank rapidly. Nearly everyone aboard drowned, including William, who was 17 years old. According to chroniclers, William initially escaped in a small boat but turned back to rescue his half-sister, causing the boat to be swamped by desperate survivors clinging to it. The prince went down with them all. Henry was in Normandy when news arrived. Contemporary chronicler Audrey Vitalis wrote that no one dared tell the king directly. Finally, they sent in a young boy to break the news, calculating that Henry would be less likely to kill the messenger if it was a child. Henry's reaction was immediate and devastating. He collapsed, overcome with grief, and, according to witnesses, never smiled again. Whether that last detail is literally true or dramatic embellishment, it captures the psychological impact of William's death. Henry had spent decades securing his kingdom, creating administrative systems that would outlast him, planning for a stable succession. And in one night of drunken celebration, all those plans drowned in the cold waters of the Channel. The succession crisis created by William's death would ultimately prove fatal for Henry and catastrophic for England. Henry had only one remaining legitimate child, his daughter Matilda. In 1127, he took the extraordinary step of forcing his barons to swear an oath, accepting Matilda as his heir. This was nearly unprecedented. Medieval Europe had queens consort women who shared their husband's power. But ruling queens or women who held power in their own right were exceptionally rare and deeply controversial. The argument went that women lacked the physical strength and martial prowess necessary for kingship, that they were too emotional and weak to make the hard decisions required of a ruler. Henry didn't care. Matilda was intelligent, educated, and his only option. He spent his remaining years trying to secure her succession, demanding repeated oaths of loyalty from reluctant barons. But Henry also complicated matters by his actions. After William's death, he had remarried, hoping for another male heir. But his second wife, Ada, Lisa of Leuven, remained childless throughout their marriage. Frustrated and desperate, Henry hedged his bets. He promoted his favorite nephew Stephen of Blois, giving him extensive lands and positions of power while simultaneously insisting everyone accept Matilda. The mixed signals were politically catastrophic. When Henry died, both Matilda and Stephen would claim the throne, and the resulting civil war known as the Monarchy would tear England apart for 19 years of bloody conflict that devastated the kingdom. Henry had worked so hard to build. The physical deterioration of Henry's health accelerated dramatically in his final years. By 1135, he was in his late 60s. Ancient by medieval standards where few people lived past 50, his digestive problems, always severe, became completely unmanageable. Chroniclers report that he suffered from increasingly frequent attacks that left him bedridden, unable to eat solid food, and in constant pain. The medieval understanding of diet meant that his condition was almost certainly worsened by the foods he consumed. The noble diet was heavily weighted toward meat, particularly game meats that were often partially spoiled by modern standards, washed down with wine and ale. Fresh vegetables were considered peasant food, dangerous and inferior. The diet that was meant to demonstrate status and wealth was slowly killing him. Medieval medical treatments reached new heights of dangerous ineffectiveness as Henry's physicians struggled to treat their increasingly ill patient. They administered compounds containing mercury, believing it would purge bad humors. Mercury is, of course, highly toxic, and would have caused additional symptoms, including tremors, tooth loss, kidney damage, and further digestive distress. They subjected him to clusters enemas that were supposed to clean the bowels, but in reality introduced bacteria and caused additional irritation and infection. They prescribed bizarre concoctions including powdered gemstones which were thought to have healing properties, based on their colors and correspondence to various organs, but which in reality were simply expensive of placebos at best and sources of additional poisoning at worst. The theory of the humors also led physicians to recommend specific foods to balance Henry's corrupted bile. They believed that hot, dry foods would counteract cold, wet humors and vice versa. This meant prescribing the precise opposite of what a modern doctor would recommend for someone with severe digestive issues. Instead of bland, easily digestible foods, Henry was given rich, heavily spiced meats, strong wines, and complex sauces, all believed to be medicinally appropriate, but all guaranteed to irritate his already devastated digestive system. Every attempt to cure him made him worse. A tragic irony that would reach its fatal conclusion in November 1135. In the autumn of that year, Henry was in Normandy, staying at his hunting lodge near Lyon-le-Forêt in the Norman countryside. He had gone there partly for pleasure, partly to oversee continuing conflicts with various Norman nobles who resented his strict rule. Contemporary chroniclers paint a picture of a king who was visibly unwell, his face pale and drawn, his body thin, despite his normally robust appetite, his energy noticeably diminished, his courtiers worried. But Henry refused to slow down or acknowledge his weakness. To admit illness would be to admit vulnerability. And at 67, with a contested succession looming, Henry could not afford to appear weak. It was precisely this stubborn refusal to acknowledge his limitations that would kill him. The fatal meal occurred in early November 1135. The exact date is disputed among chroniclers, but the details are remarkably consistent. Henry was presented with a dish of lampreys, a type of joyless fish that was considered a delicacy in medieval Europe. Lampreys are parasitic creatures eel-like in appearance, that attach to other fish with circular mouths full of teeth and feed on their blood and tissues. They are, by modern standards, somewhat horrifying to look at. But medieval nobility considered them the height of luxury. They were expensive, difficult to catch, and their rich fatty flesh was prized. Henry loved lampreys and had eaten them throughout his life. Despite their reputation for being difficult to digest on this particular occasion, Henry's personal physician, a man whose name is unfortunately lost to history, explicitly warned the king not to eat the lampreys. According to chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, the physician had noticed that the fish smelled off, suggesting they were not entirely fresh. In an era before refrigeration, when fish had to be transported long distances from the coast to inland hunting lodges, spoilage was a constant risk. The physician's warning was clear and direct. These lampreys were dangerous, and given the king's known digestive problems, eating them would be catastrophic. But Henry, whether out of pride, stubbornness, or simple love of the delicacy, dismissed the warning. He was the king. He would eat what he pleased, and no physician would dictate his menu. It was a decision that would kill him within the month. Henry ate the lampreys, and according to the chronicles, initially seemed fine. The meal concluded without incident, and the king went about his business. But within hours, the familiar symptoms began. Except this time they were far more severe than usual. The stomach cramps started first waves of pain that doubled Henry over and left him gasping. Then came the diarrhea. Violent and uncontrollable. Far worse than even his chronic condition had produced before Henry's servants rushed to attend him. But there was little they could do except provide chamber pots and clean linens, watching helplessly as their king suffered. What Henry was experiencing was almost certainly a severe case of food poisoning, possibly from bacterial contamination in the spoiled lampreys, possibly from parasites that infected the fish, or quite possibly from accumulated toxins in the lamprey flesh itself. Modern science has identified various risks associated with eating lampreys, including bioaccumulation of heavy metals and environmental toxins in their tissues, and the presence of natural toxins in their mucus and tissues that can cause severe gastrointestinal distress. In Henry's time, none of this was understood. They simply knew that bad food could make you sick, but not why or how, and certainly not how to treat it. Beyond their useless humoral theories, Henry's physicians immediately began their treatments. And in doing so, they transformed a serious case of food poisoning into a death sentence. They administered powerful purgative herbal concoctions designed to induce vomiting and further evacuate the bowels. believing they were helping his body expel the bad humors. In reality, they were dehydrating an already dehydrating patient and irritating his digestive system even further. They performed bloodletting, opening veins in his arms to drain what they calculated as excess blood. Corrupted by bad humors, this reduced his blood volume and his body's ability to maintain blood pressure and circulate oxygen to his organs. Every intervention made him worse. And as he got worse, they increased the intensity of their treatments, convinced that more aggressive therapy would eventually balance his humors. Within days, Henry was clearly dying. The diarrhea continued unabated, now mixed with blood, indicating that his intestines were ulcerated and bleeding internally. He developed a fever, his body's attempt to fight infection. But in his weakened state, the fever only added to his misery, causing delirium and confusion. He became unable to keep down even water, and severe dehydration began to affect his brain function. Chroniclers report that Henry began to ramble incoherently, speaking to people who weren't there, reliving memories from decades past, sometimes lucid and sometimes completely disoriented. The once sharp mind that had administered 2 kingdoms was dissolving into confused fragments. The smell became unbearable. Medieval people were accustomed to unpleasant odors. But what emanated from the king's chamber was beyond normal experience. The constant diarrhea mixed with blood and bits of sloughed intestinal lining, the fever, sweat, the lack of adequate washing. As Henry was too weak to be properly cleaned, all combined to create a stench so powerful that servants had to wrap cloth around their faces to enter the room. Nobles who came to pay their respects found themselves gagging and retreating quickly. The proud courtiers who had spent years vying for the king's favor now competed to find excuses not to attend him. No one wanted to witness the degradation of their monarch, and no one wanted to be remembered as present during his humiliating final days. As Henry's condition deteriorated, his body began to literally decompose while he was still alive. The severe diarrhea and vomiting had destroyed the lining of his digestive tract. Without functioning intestines, the bacteria that normally live in the gut in a controlled symbiotic relationship began to proliferate wildly, producing gases and toxins that accumulated in his body cavity. His abdomen swelled, grotesquely distended with gas and fluid, while the rest of his body wasted away from dehydration and inability to absorb nutrients. His skin took on a grayish, waxy appearance, and sores developed where he lay in his own waste, too weak to move or be moved without extreme pain. Henry, the First of England, was rotting from the inside out, and everyone knew that death was only a matter of time. The political implications of the king's condition became immediately apparent. Nobles, who had sworn oaths to support Matilda as heir, began making private calculations. A woman ruler was controversial enough, but Matilda was currently a non-Jew with her husband, Geoffrey, father of the future, Henry II. She would take weeks to reach England, possibly months to secure her position. Meanwhile, Stephen of Blois was in Bologna just across the channel, and he had significant support among the barons who preferred a male ruler and liked Stephen's easier, more generous personality compared to Henry's severe efficiency. As Henry lay dying in his hunting lodge, messengers were already riding hard in multiple directions. Some to inform Matilda, others to alert Stephen. Everyone positioning themselves for the succession struggle that would inevitably follow. Henry's final days were marked by moments of terrible lucidity, interspersed with delirium during his clear moments. He apparently realized what was happening to him and understood that there would be no recovery. Medieval chroniclers, who generally tried to present kings as dying piously with prayers on their lips, struggled to reconcile Henry's undignified physical state with the expected narrative of a holy death. Some accounts claim he called for priests and made confession, receiving the last rites of the church. Others suggest he was too weak and delirious for proper religious observance. What seems clear is that Henry spent his final conscious moments in tremendous physical pain, stripped of dignity, abandoned by the courtiers who had once fought for his attention alone, except for the servants who had no choice but to remain. On December 1st, 1135, Henry, the friend of England, finally died. Contemporary sources offer varying details about his final moments, but all agree on the essential horror of his passing. His body had become so toxic, so filled with infectious material and decomposition gases that his abdomen was grotesquely swollen. Some chroniclers claim that at the moment of death or shortly after his body essentially burst, the pressure of accumulated gases rupturing his distended stomach and intestines. Whether this literally occurred in the dramatic fashion described or whether chroniclers embellished the details to emphasize the tragedy and disgust is debated by modern historians. What is certain is that Henry's corpse was in such terrible condition that it shocked everyone who saw it. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death presented practical problems that no one was prepared to handle. The body needed to be transported from Normandy to England for burial, but it was in no condition for transport. The corpse was already putrefying, the result of internal bacterial infection that had begun before death, and the journey to the coast, and then across the channel, would take days at minimum. Medieval embalming techniques were primitive, compared to later methods, consisting primarily of washing the body, removing the internal organs and packing the cavities with salt and herbs. But Henry's body was so corrupted that even approaching it was difficult. The smell was overwhelming, and the condition of the corpse suggested that any attempt to open it for embalming might result in even worse conditions. The task of preparing Henry's body fell to a man described in chronicles simply as a physician or sometimes as an embalmer. Though the latter term barely existed in the medieval vocabulary, this unfortunate individual was paid, according to some accounts, an enormous sum of money to undertake the horrific task of dealing with the king's corpse. He insisted that everyone else leave the room, understanding that what he was about to do would be so revolting that witnesses might flee or become ill. Working alone, he began the process of trying to clean and prepare the body for its final journey. The exact details of what he had to do are mercifully not recorded in explicit detail. But chronicles note that the task took hours and that the physician emerged from the room visibly ill, having been overcome by the fumes and the horrific state of the body. Medieval chroniclers, particularly those writing slightly later with some distance from the events, were not shy about emphasizing the symbolic implications of Henry's death. They saw in his undignified side end a moral lesson about pride, the vanity of earthly power, and the leveling nature of death. Henry of Huntingdon, writing his Historia Anglorum within decades of Henry's death, explicitly connected the king's fate to his stubborn refusal to follow his physician's advice about the lampreys. It was in Henry of Huntingdon's view divine punishment for pride and gluttony, a warning to the mighty that they remained subject to God's will and the limitations of mortal flesh. Whether one accepts this medieval moralizing or not, the contrast between Henry's reputation for intelligence and self-control and his death from stubbornly eating spoiled fish is indeed striking. The journey of Henry's body from Lyme-la-Forêt to the coast was a macabre procession. Despite the best efforts of the embalmer, the corpse continued to decay and produce such overwhelming odors that the funeral cortege had to stop frequently to burn incense and spices in an attempt to mask the smell. Local people reportedly fled from the procession, making signs against evil, believing that the terrible stench indicated something unnatural or cursed about the king's death. This reaction, while superstitious by modern standards, reveals how shocking Henry's condition was, even to people accustomed to the realities of death and decay. The procession must have been a bizarre and horrible sight. Nobles and soldiers escorting a cart, carrying a corpse that was literally too full to approach closely, burning incense and herbs in a futile attempt to maintain some dignity for their dead king. When Henry's body finally reached Rome, it was clear that the condition had continued to worsen. The corpse was placed in Rouen Cathedral temporarily, where priests performed funeral rites, though even they were reportedly overcome by the smell and had to work in shifts. The body was then taken across the Channel to England, a journey that took several days, given weather conditions and the need to wait for appropriate winds and tides. The ship that carried Henry's corpse must have been an unpleasant vessel. Indeed, one can only imagine the crew's reaction to their cargo, which by this point had been dead for over a week and was in advanced stages of decomposition despite all preservation efforts. Henry was finally buried at Reading Abbey, a monastery he had founded and richly endowed. The burial itself was reportedly rushed, with attendees eager to conclude the ceremony and escape the overwhelming smell. The grave was dug deep, presumably in part to contain the odors, and the coffin was sealed as quickly as possible. Reading Abbey would later become one of the most important religious houses in England, but its founding and its association with Henry I were forever marked by the circumstances of his interment. Monks would pray for Henry's soul for centuries, but they must have told and retold the story of his horrific death and burial, a cautionary tale about mortality and the limits of earthly power. The political consequences of Henry's death were immediate and catastrophic. Despite the oath sworn to support Matilda, Stephen of Blue acted with remarkable speed. He crossed the Channel within days of receiving news of Henry's death, rode to London and was crowned King of England by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Before Matilda could even arrive from Anjou, Stephen's coup succeeded in part because of simple logistics. He was closer and moved faster, but also because many barons preferred him to Matilda. The question of whether Henry's undignified death influenced this preference is intriguing. Did Stephen's supporters rationalize their oath-breaking by suggesting that a king who died in such shameful circumstances had perhaps lost God's favor? Did the physical horror of Henry Sendernays undermine the mystique of kingship that was supposed to make succession question and clear? Matilda, when she learned of her father's death and Stephen's use of passion, was predictably furious. She gathered her forces and invaded England in 1139, launching the civil war known as the Monarchy that would devastate the kingdom for nearly 2 decades. England descended into chaos as rival factions fought for control, with neither Stephen nor Matilda able to achieve decisive victory. Castles were built without royal permission as local lords took advantage of weak central authority. Trade declined. Agriculture was disrupted by armies foraging and fighting across the countryside, and the common people suffered terribly. Chronicles from this period are filled with descriptions of famine, violence, and general. The sophisticated administrative system Henry had built crumbled as the exchequer ceased to function effectively. Royal justice became sporadic and arbitrary, and England fragmented into competing zones of influence. The anarchy finally ended only in 1153 with the Treaty of Wallingford, which recognized Stephen as king for his lifetime, but designated Matilda's son Henry II as his heir. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry II inherited a kingdom that had been ravaged by 19 years of civil war. The young king spent the early years of his reign rebuilding the administrative and legal systems his grandfather had created, establishing the Angela Empire that would dominate Western Europe for decades. But the kingdom Henry II inherited was fundamentally damaged by the succession crisis, and historians have long debated whether Henry the Firm could have prevented the anarchy by remarrying earlier. After his first wife's death, by having more sons with his second wife, or by making clearer and more enforceable succession arrangements. The question of whether different choices about succession would have mattered is complicated by the symbolic damage done by the first manner of death. Medieval kingship rested on the assumption that kings were divinely chosen and maintained in power by God's will. A king who died gloriously in battle or peacefully in old age, surrounded by his family and court, confirmed this divine sanction. But a king who died in agony, his body literally rotting before death, abandoned by his nobles, surrounded by filth and stench. This death suggested something had gone terribly wrong. Had God withdrawn his favor? Was the royal line coerced? These questions would have circulated through the nobility and influence, their willingness to honor oaths to Matilda or to support Stephen's coup. The medical reality of what killed Henry. The first is from a modern perspective, fairly straightforward. He ate spoiled food containing bacterial pathogens, possibly salmonella or similar bacteria that flourish in contaminated seafood. The resulting food poisoning caused severe gastroenteritis, massive fluid loss through diarrhea and vomiting, and secondary infection as damaged intestinal walls allowed bacteria to enter his bloodstream. The medieval medical response of purgative and bloodletting accelerated his dehydration and weakened his body's ability to fight the infection in a modern hospital. Henry would have been given intravenous fluids to counteract dehydration, antibiotics to fight bacterial infection, and supportive care to allow his digestive system to heal. He would have been uncomfortable blood, but would likely have survived. Instead, medieval medicine killed him as surely as the spoiled lampreys. But understanding the medical mechanics of Henry's death does not diminish the historical significance of how he died. The manner of a king's death mattered enormously in medieval political culture. Kings were expected to die well to demonstrate piety, courage, and dignity. Even in their final moments, a good death confirmed the king's virtue and God's favor. A bad death raised troubling questions. Henry's death was not merely bad, but spectacularly awful. Combining elements of disgust, humiliation, physical horror, and symbolic failure, his stubborn decision to ignore medical advice and eat the lampreys could be read as pride. One of the 7 deadly sins. His subsequent suffering could be interpreted as divine punishment. The physical corruption of his body could be seen as reflecting some deeper spiritual corruption or the withdrawal of divine grace. These interpretation organs may seem superstitious and moralistic to modern readers, but they had real political consequences. In 1135, the nobility who broke their oaths to Matilda and supported Stephen needed to justify their actions both to themselves and to contemporaries who might accuse them of oath-breaking and treason. The horror of Henry's death provided a convenient justification. If God had allowed such a terrible fate to befall Henry, perhaps the succession arrangements he had made were not truly blessed. Perhaps God preferred Stephen, whose seizure of the throne proceeded smoothly while Matilda's claim led only to war and chaos. Such reasoning may be self-serving and circular, but it provided a framework within which medieval nobles could rationalize political choices. The story of Henry I's death also reveals the profound tension in medieval society between the ideal of kingship and the reality of kings as human beings with human bodies subject to disease, aging, and decay. Medieval political theory emphasized that the king had two bodies: the body natural, which was mortal and subject to all the weaknesses of flesh, and the body politic, which was immortal and represented the continuity of the kingdom. When a king died, the body natural ceased, but the body politic transferred seamlessly to the heir expressed in the formula: "The king is dead. Long live the king do that." But what happened when the body natural in such a degrading way that it undermined the dignity of the body politic? How could one maintain the fiction of divine kingship when the king died drowning in his own filth? These questions were not merely theoretical. For the people who witnessed or heard about Henry's death, they lived in a world where physical signs were believed to reveal spiritual realities, where God was understood to intervene directly in human affairs through miracles and punishments, and where the stability of their entire society depended on maintaining the mystique of royal authority. Henry's death threatened that mystique in ways that a battlefield, death, or even a sudden illness and peaceful passing would not have. It was a reminder impossible to ignore that kings were just men subject to all the indignities and suffering that flesh is heir to, and no amount of power, wealth, or administrative genius could protect them from the fundamental vulnerability of human embodiment. The chroniclers who recorded Henry's death struggled with how to present it. On one hand, they needed to record historical truth and saw in Henry's fate a moral lesson about pride and mortality. On the other hand, they were writing in a world where respect for monarchy was essential to social order. And describing a king's death in too much degrading detail could undermine royal authority in general. The result is chronicles that are often contradictory, some emphasizing the horror in explicit terms, others being more circumspect and focusing on Henry's deathbed, piety, and final religious observances. Reading between the lines of these accounts, comparing different versions, historians can reconstruct what likely happened, even as they recognize that the full horror was probably even worse than the censored versions that survive. One particularly chilling detail that appears in several chronicles concerns the reaction of Henry's illegitimate children. As mentioned, Henry had at least 25 acknowledged bastards, many of whom held significant positions in his administration and had benefited greatly from royal patronage when their father lay dying. Several were in Normandy and could have attended him, yet most found excuses not to come or came briefly and then left as quickly as possible. This abandonment by his own children, people who owed their status and wealth entirely to his father, reveals how thoroughly the horror of his condition overwhelmed normal, familial, and political obligations. No one, not even family, wanted to be associated with his degradation or risk being remembered as present during his shameful end. The servants who had no choice but to attend Henry during his final days left no written records of their own, medieval servants being generally illiterate and they're rarely recorded. But one can imagine their experience and sympathize with their predicament. They would have been exposed to disease risk, constantly handling contaminated materials, cleaning their king while he suffered. They would have heard his delirious ravings, seen his body literally decompose before death, dealt with the overwhelming smell and the practical difficulties of caring for someone in advanced stages of toxic shock and sepsis. These servants would have been traumatized by the experience, and likely some of them became ill themselves from exposure to whatever pathogens were causing Henry's gastroenteritis. Yet their names are lost to history, remembered only as anonymous attendants in the death of a king. The embalmer who prepared Henry's body deserves special consideration. His name is not recorded in most chronicles, Though one source suggests he was called Hugh, he was reportedly paid 100 shillings for the work, an enormous sum equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. This suggests that his contemporaries fully understood how difficult and revolting his task was. According to some accounts, the embalmer himself died shortly after completing his work, possibly from exposure to disease, possibly from the toxic gases released when he opened Henry's body. If this is true, and several chronicles mention it, though others do not, then the embalmer became a kind of final victim of Henry's death, killed by the same condition that killed the king. He was paid to prepare for burial. The fate of the physician who warned Henry not to eat the lampreys is unknown. Chronicles do not record his name or what happened to him after the king ignored his advice and died as a result. One wonders what he thought and felt, watching his clear warning be dismissed out of royal pride, then watching helplessly as his worst predictions came true and the king died an agonizing death that might have been prevented by simply choosing a different meal. Did he feel vindicated but also guilty that he had not argued more forcefully? Did he fear that he might be blamed anyway? That royal family is looking for scapegoats might decide the physicians should have refused to serve the lampreys entirely rather than merely warning against them? Or did he simply feel the helpless frustration of a medical professional whose expertise is ignored by a stubborn patient, multiplied by the fact that his patient was a king and his patient's death would lead to civil war? Modern historians and medical professionals have examined the historical accounts of Henry's death and debated what exactly killed him. The consensus is some form of severe food poisoning, possibly complicated by his pre-existing digestive disorder. Some have suggested that Henry may have had inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis, which would explain his chronic symptoms throughout his life and would have made him particularly vulnerable to bacterial gastroenteritis. Others have proposed that he may have had gallstones or chronic pancreatitis, also consistent with his reported symptoms. What is clear is that he was already in poor health, that the spoiled lampreys introduced a severe infection, and that medieval medical treatment ensured he had no chance of recovery. There is also the question of whether the lampreys were truly spoiled by accident, or whether they might have been deliberately contaminated. Medieval courts were hotbeds of intrigue, and poison was a known method of assassination. However, most historians reject conspiracy theories in this case. The accounts are consistent that the physician warned about the fish smelling off before Henry ate them, suggesting the problem was obvious spoilage rather than subtle poisoning. Moreover, if someone wanted to kill Henry through poisoned food, they would presumably not choose a method that produced such a spectacularly public and undignified death which risked exposing the plot. Simple food spoilage and the king's stubborn refusal to listen to medical advice is sufficient explanation without requiring conspiracy. The story of Henry I's death has echoed through the centuries as a cautionary tale. Medieval chroniclers used it as a moral lesson about pride and the importance of listening to medical advice. Renaissance writers invoked it as an example of the vanity of earthly power and the leveling nature of death. Modern historians study it as a case study in medieval medicine, political culture, and the succession crisis that followed. But perhaps the most universal aspect of the story is simply its reminder of human vulnerability. Henry the Phone was, by any measure, a successful king. Intelligent, effective, ruthless, when necessary, capable of building institutions that would long outlast him. Yet none of that protected him from death. And not just death, but death in the most degrading possible circumstances. There is something almost Greek tragic about the specific way Henry died. His greatest strength was arguably his refusal to admit weakness, his determination to project power and control at all times. This strength allowed him to intimidate rebellious nobles, maintain order across two territories prone to conflict, and build effective bureaucratic systems staffed by men who feared his oversight. But this same refusal to admit weakness led him to ignore his physician's clear warning about the lampreys. He would not appear weak by following a doctor's cautious advice about his sensitive stomach. His strength became his fatal flaw, and the result was a death that destroyed the very image of strength he had spent a lifetime building. The impact of Henry's death on medieval conceptions of kingship is difficult to quantify, but was certainly significant. Later, medieval writers discussing the nature of royal authority and the divine right of kings would sometimes invoke Henry's fate as a complicating example. If even successful kings could die such degrading circumstances, what did that mean for theories of divine sanction? Some used it to argue for the importance of royal virtue and humility, suggesting that Henry's pride in refusing medical advice brought divine punishment. Others used it to emphasize the importance of clear succession planning, pointing out that Henry's failure to produce a stable succession led directly to the anarchy. Still, others simply noted it as of fortune's mutability, a reminder that everyone, even kings, remains subject to chance, illness, and death. The Reading Abbey, where Henry was buried, became an important center of learning and pilgrimage in the medieval period. Ironically, given the horror of his death and burial, Henry's tomb became a site of veneration, and miracles were supposedly reported there. This speaks to the medieval ability to separate the physical reality of death from the spiritual significance of the deceased. Henry might have died in the most undignified manner possible, but he was still a king who founded the abbey, endowed it richly, and was buried in holy ground. The spiritual meaning could be maintained even when the physical facts were deeply compromising. Reading Abbey was largely destroyed during Henry, the eighth dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, and Henry, the firm's actual burial site, now uncertain, lost somewhere beneath the ruins. In the final analysis, the death of Henry I matters both as a historical event with significant political consequences and as a human story about suffering, dignity, and mortality. The political consequences are clear. His death triggered the anarchy, 19 years of civil war that devastated England and weakened the kingdom significantly. The immediate cause was the succession dispute between Matilda and Stephen. But the deeper cause was that Henry's death was so shocking and undignified that it undermined the certainty, legitimacy that should have attached to his designated heir. If God had truly favored Matilda's succession, would he have allowed her father to die in such terrible circumstances? But beyond the political analysis, there is the simple human reality of a man dying badly. Medieval sources, for all their moralizing and their concern with political implications, do not completely obscure the suffering of the historical person. Henry, the wife, spent his final days in agony, his body betraying him completely, his dignity destroyed, abandoned by almost everyone who had claimed to serve him, conscious enough, at times, to understand what was happening but unable to do anything about it. He died alone in pain, in filth, and his body was in such terrible condition that dealing with his corpse was considered a task requiring hazard pay. This is the fate that awaited one of medieval Europe's most powerful and successful rulers. A reminder that power and success provide no immunity to suffering or to the fundamental indignity of bodily failure. Henry, the first story, also reminds us of the limits of medieval medicine and the ways in which medical ignorance could transform survivable conditions into death sentences. A modern patient with Henry's food poisoning would be uncomfortable, but would almost certainly survive with basic supportive care. But medieval physicians operating under completely incorrect theories about disease and the body administered treatments that hastened his death. They were not malicious or incompetent by the standards of their time. They were doing what the best medical theory of the age recommended. But the result was that their treatments actively killed their patient. This is worth remembering, not to mock medieval medicine, but to appreciate the hard-won nature of modern medical knowledge and to maintain appropriate humility about what current medicine may get wrong. The final lesson of Henry Defend's death might be about the importance of listening to expert advice, even when it contradicts our desires or our pride. Henry's physician warned him clearly and explicitly not to eat the lampreys. If Henry had listened, he would likely have lived longer, might have been able to manage the succession better, might have prevented or mitigated the anarchy. But he didn't listen because he was the king, because he had spent a lifetime making decisions and not being questioned. Because admitting that his stomach was too weak for his favorite food would have been a small admission of vulnerability that his pride could not accept. So he ate the lampreys and died, and his kingdom fell into chaos. The lesson transcends its medieval context. Expertise matters. Warnings should be heeded, and pride should not override prudent caution. Even for kings, perhaps especially for kings, given the consequences of their decisions for others. Henry thus died on December 1, 1135, after nearly 35 years as King of England. He had conquered his brother's duchy, reformed English administration and law, built the first sophisticated financial bureaucracy in English history, and attempted against impossible odds to secure the succession for his daughter. In a world that did not accept female rulers, he was in many ways a great king. But he will forever be remembered not primarily for his achievements, but for his death. The king who stubbornly ate spoiled oysters against medical advice, who spent his final days rotting from severe diarrhea, whose body literally burst with decomposition gases, and whose undignified end shocked the medieval world and helped trigger a devastating civil war. It is a reminder that in the end, no matter who we are or what we achieve, we are all subject to the vulnerabilities of human flesh. And the manner of our death may eclipse the accomplishments of our life in the memory of posterity. The terrifying and final days of King Henry. The France stand as one of history's most graphic illustrations of the distance between power and reality, between the image of kingship and the brutal facts of human mortality. His story, for all its medieval specificity, speaks to something timeless about human vulnerability, the limits of power, and the ultimate democracy of death. We may not face the exact challenges Henry faced, but we all face mortality. We all have bodies that can fail us, and we all must reckon with the gap between who we want to be and what our physical reality allows. Henry's fate is extreme, even by medieval standards, unusually horrific. But in its extremity it makes visible truths that are always present, but usually easier to ignore, that we are not as much in control as we like to believe, that our bodies will betray us, and that in the end, dignity is harder to maintain than power is to seize.